Hey, Acers. I want to first make sure before I go into the explanation of why James Bond or how James Bond influenced me in my game mastering. I want to start and make sure that I've covered a concept of the novum. It's something that I'm going to keep bringing up again and again. And so I want to make sure that I have covered it with you guys in a video. Now, the idea of a novum is well, there's a genre that I call speculative fiction, and it's called that in several academic literatures. And in the way I describe it, there's a big X. And there are four major subgenres of speculative fiction. And what makes them different is the way that the tool of speculative fiction is used. And that tool, I believe I have mentioned to you before, is called the novum. The novum is the new concept or idea or whatever it is in that story that sets that world apart from our world. And it's what sets your role playing game world apart from our world. So in that X, at the I left or right side, it doesn't really matter. But let's start over here with science fiction. Science fiction is possibly my favorite, and it is the where the novum is making it slightly different than our world, but in a logical way. So if somebody used genetic manipulation to remanufacture woolly mammoths and cavemen, you could still buy that. You could still say, okay, that could somebody could tinker around and do that. And there's other things of science fiction that are there. On the other side of the X, we have fantasy, which usually encompasses things that really couldn't be. We know that somebody can't just wave a wand and poof out comes a ray of lightning that'll kill somebody. That at least not with the technology that we have, not with the understanding of the world that we have. And so that fantasy is stuff that really couldn't be to our logical minds. Some people, one person once jokingly said that fantasy is just science fiction with trees. So take your pick there. The upper part of this I give to the upper part of the X up here is horror. And in that one, the novum, something that it falls into one of two categories. Either one, should not be. It's something that somebody created or something happened and it should not be, but forces beyond our control, which kind of falls into the second category of things that human beings cannot understand, that just cannot be understood. So those are things of horror. Those horror elements might have created that thing that should not be. Like maybe in Friday the 13th, the revenant of Jason that keeps coming back is just a thing that should not be because his mother got his corrupted body back from places where it shouldn't have come back from through powers that she shouldn't have been using. And then finally, down at the bottom of the X, down here, we have mystery. And mystery is a subgenre of speculative fiction because you deal with it in the same way you would deal with science fiction, fantasy, or horror. You deal with it in the way of we don't know what this thing is, and we can't stop it. Maybe it shouldn't be, but actually, what the thing is actually a thing that we know already. So it's a known thing, and that's where James Bond comes in. James Bond is pretty solid mystery, but with a little bit of input from the science fiction side. Because some of the tools and gadgets that James Bond uses really don't exist and couldn't exist. So, indulge me a little bit to talk about James Bond and how he influenced my game mastering. So, one of the things that I wanted to talk about is that James Bond put in me a love of spy fiction. And mind you, I like sci-fi spy fiction, like stuff in space kind of thing. I like that probably just a little bit more than actual spy fiction, but I've read a lot of histories and a lot of other biographies and things like that, and spies have always been fascinating to me. As a matter of fact, I always jokingly say that people want to part of the reason why some people want to get top secret clearance is because top secret is the first step on becoming a spy, and there are lots of people who want to be spies. And part of the reason why we want to be spies is because of James Bond. Now, there are other spies who came after James Bond for me, like Jason Bourne. But I'm not talking Jason Bourne of any of the other films other than maybe the one in Bourne Identity. I'll take Jason Bourne and Bourne Identity. That was a good movie. I thought it was a bit of a refrigerator moment when they shoot Marie at the beginning of Bourne Supremacy to get him back into action, and that just kind of I just couldn't allow myself to get into those. And so that's where it was inspiring to me to read actual biographies of spies and stories about fictional spies. I admittedly didn't read a James Bond novel until I was in my 20s. And when I read it, it was Moonraker. And that one was about a nuclear missile that could reach somewhere far away. It was one of the first ICBMs. And that's what it was all about. It wasn't about going into space. And it wasn't about the guys in the spacesuits with the lasers on their chests. And I loved that movie as a kid. But I've never liked Jaws as a villain. But I haven't. There's something about him that bugged me, but I really liked Jaws in the James Bond franchise. But like I said, I didn't. There's something that bugged me about him. So there's that. And then there's the fact that that I got turned on to Ian Fleming and who he was and the worlds that he created for James Bond. Now, Ian Fleming, interestingly enough, was part of naval intelligence for the Brits during World War II, and he also was part of the Irregulars, a spy ring that was run by a Canadian spy master out of Canada that spied in the United States. And their main thing to do as they spied in the United States was to keep an eye on the socialites who were going to try and encourage Roosevelt to come in the war on the side of the Nazis and to persuade them back to the side of the British. And two of the spies that worked for that ring, like I said, Fleming was one, and someone he absolutely hated was the other one. And you would know him as the British author Roald Dahl. And Roald Dahl Fleming hated him so much that one of the first people who gets killed in one of the first Bond novels and one of the first Bond anythings is a British person of Norwegian descent and that's who gets killed in the very first. And that was his send up to Dahl because he really didn't care for him. Now there are several elements of the Bond stories that are pretty consistent. Now, mind you, these weren't tropes, these weren't cliches when it first came out in 1962. Did 1962's Dr. No have a Bond villain? Oh, yes, it did. And he's one of my favorite villains, Dr. No. And, excuse me, he took the idea of the rocketry program, the early rocketry program in 1961-ish, 1960-ish, and had a villain who was threatening to destroy that rocket program so that the Soviets could get their missiles up first, their rockets up first. And so he was using radio waves to tweak American interests there. And that's where Leiter comes in, Felix Leiter. He comes into the stories in Dr. No. So with all of this, you get another trope of the Bond stories. You get that he's involved in huge world-spanning politics and stuff that not only helps Britain, but also helps the world. And you also get the trope of the Ursula Andress character and the beautiful Bond girl. And I will say that with the exception of a couple Bond girls that I personally didn't care for, Denise Richards, excuse me, you can't convince me that Denise Richards was a nuclear scientist. I'm sorry. That's just personally to me, knowing all the other stuff that she's been in, I do not think she was a very good pick for a Bond girl. But that's just my opinion. So what do I know? I've never made a movie. I've never made $1 million. Probably never will. But that's my opinion. I'll throw it out there. But they had bad names. They had bad. There were some that were good and some that were bad. And I mean, I think if you count the photographer, there's at least 3 Bond women in um in Doctor No. But Ursula Andress was the poster child one, and he was a romancer. He was a suave, debonair womanizer, and that I think is one of the flaws of James Bond is the womanizing. I think that there is something to be said about respecting an intimate partner and marrying that intimate partner and staying faithful to one. Now, mind you, Bond did have in the second, or it wasn't the second Bond film. It was, but in the second Bond actor, they chose to do On Her Majesty's Secret Service, in which James Bond does get married, and he was played by Australian actor George Lazenby. And a lot of people hate on George Lazenby, but I think that On Her Majesty's Secret Service is still a well told story. Now, I do also acknowledge that there's another trope that comes in, another cliche, if you will, of the Bond villain. They're usually a little over the top, but I'll get to the Bond villain in a minute because I believe that the Bond villain is possibly one of the best things that any game master can choose to research and grab, because a Bond villain can almost be taken whole cloth as he is in the stories and put straight into your adventure. So he also, James Bond has some positive masculine traits. And those positive traits can include things like the fact that he just goes out and does it. I know that there are plenty of good women out there who go out and do it, but he doesn't need to be any more than just told, go out and do it. And he goes out and he tries to accomplish things. He's not wishy-washy. He just does what James Bond does. And one of the things that I agree with one of the write-ups on James Bond, in the books, he's not that much of a cold-blooded killer, even though he has a license to kill. In the movies, he's killing everybody all the time. The Bonds that I love that Sean Connery did such a good job with James Bond that Ian Fleming took him and rewrote him. And yes, he is a male's fantasy. James Bond is a male fantasy. And it's not, like I said, not always wholesome. But at the same time, there's something that my wife has told me she finds very attractive as a man in a very nice pressed suit. And that's another thing about James Bond, is he was fashionable in the movies. In the books, he's kind of doing what I'm doing today and kind of being a little casual. But in the movies, he is always the pinnacle of fashion. And he is sharp. So there's something to be said about that. And another thing about James Bond is that even when he is wounded, hurt, or otherwise delayed, he still pushes on and pushes through. So these are all good traits. Getting things done, pushing through when times are rough. These are traits we want to help our player characters develop. And there are, like I said, there are actors that I like better as James Bond. And no, Daniel Craig is not at the top of my list. My top is still the original Sean Connery. And then I would say my second, because there's Sean Connery, then there's every other Bond actor down here. Craig did a good job, but I didn't particularly like the blonde Bond idea. He was always black hair. So the Bond that's closest to the Bond in the books as far as actions and overall looks is probably Timothy Dalton, but the Bond that's and Pierce Brosnan will always be close to my heart. Then you talk about Bond villains. I mentioned them earlier, but let's talk for a second about Bond villains. They usually have some sort of world dominating plot or world chaos plot. They have resources. They have political resources that protect them. They have all sorts of different things that make them almost untouchable by anyone except Bond. And it becomes them going head to head. I mean, Mads Mikkelsen's crying Le Chiffre in Casino Royale. He and James Bond, that was one of the most intense rivalries I had ever seen. And I really liked a lot of those things in there. Another great villain was, of course, Alex Trevelyan in Goldeneye, which incidentally was named after the place where Ian Fleming would go to write his Bond stories in the Caribbean. And that character, played by Sean Bean, after Bond himself, was so amazing. Or when Smersh went after Bond in the second From Russia with Love, with that blonde spy who was almost basically he was the Soviet version of James Bond, and those two went the rounds, and that fight in the train is just so absolutely amazing. And James Bond really doesn't do well at physical fighting. And then there's Jaws, of course. I have mixed feelings on Jaws, but Jaws is there. Also, there's just all sorts of great villains that came across. I mean, Odd Job. I couldn't not mention Odd Job in the thing. And the other thing that I like about James Bond is the Q department. And Q, played by the great late Desmond Llewellyn, he was just he was one of my favorite actors. I think that's the correct name. I'm gonna actually now I have my mind saying who played Q in James Bond. It was Desmond Llewellyn. He did it in 17 of the Bond films between 1963 and 1999. So he was a great actor in that. And this is where the sci-fi comes into the James Bond franchise. And that is that James Bond, he always went into the field with spy gadgets. And that's one of the things I love. And you can definitely bring spy gadgets in. But how would you convert spy gadgets to something in a fantasy world? What kind of spy gadgets would they have? Ask yourself that question. I might even do just a short to just isolate that question. But Q giving all of the different devices that James Bond used, and like the powder that you had, or the suitcase thing that if you opened it the one way, the magnetic case of powder wouldn't puff out into your face with an irritant, but if you open it the wrong way, and or like even well, just this wasn't a Q thing, but when in Doctor No, James Bond takes out one of his hairs and gets it wet and sticks it on his closet door to make sure that nobody's messed with his closet, and then when he just the different spy things he does, those are so cool, and they were really cool to me when I was a young and impressionable age. I watched all the Bond films from Doctor No all the way through. I stayed current up through Casino Royale, and then I dropped off the Bond wagon. So there are negatives though about the character of James Bond. In the books, he uses his mind a lot more to try and make sure that there is less of a threat to the crown, and he kills a lot less. In the books or the movies, he's killing everybody all the time, with his own hands, shooting guns most of the time, or chasing them down and pushing them off things. Um, and I really respect that George Lazenby's movie. He was married, and he had his intimate partner, but I do not see that as a necessarily always positive thing. That he just is that womanizer. I mentioned that. So, what can we use from James Bond? One more thing I got to throw in before I get to that question. There's a card game from the company Cheap Ass Games that came out in the late 90s, early noughties, that is one of the things that I love about James Bond. And it's not James Bond officially, they actually got in trouble for using it, but the game is called Before I Kill You, Mr. Bond. And that's something else that you can always do, because it has James Bond brings us the best villain monologues. Oh, they're so great. But in the game Before I Kill You, Mr. Bond, which I have, now it's, I guess, Before I Kill You, Mr. Spy or whatever. But the idea is that you've got these yellow cards in your hand, and you're a super secret evil villain, and you have cards that are layer cards, so you can put things in there like a moist bar or a radar system or things like that, and you build up the strength and power of your evil villain layer. And then you also have green cards that are the spy cards, because everybody can see the spy in a crowd. So that became a cliche of the James Bond films. You always knew who the spy was because he was Bond, James Bond. And then the other yellow card you have in your hand is what's called a doubler, and that is how you taunt the villain. Things like, "Before I kill you, Mr. Bond, I insist on throwing you into my giant shark tank, blithely unaware that all shark tanks have giant drains," meaning he can get out. Or, "Before I kill you, Mr. Bond, I'm going to throw you in this cell wearing nothing but your ordinary looking wristwatch," which always had a laser in it because Q put that in there. Or, "I challenge you to a blindfolded karate match," or "I challenge you to a final chess tournament," or "Let me introduce you to my assistant who will inevitably turn on me." That kind of thing. Those inevitabilities, that "curse your inevitable foiling of my plans," that was James Bond. So what can we use from this? One, we can use the villains. And we can use their plots and their schemings. And what if you're using a villain, though, who doesn't have resources but has the level of plots and schemes that go up against your heroes? What else can we use from James Bond? We can use the sneakiness, because James Bond had to sneak into places and not be noticed, or once he got captured, not get noticed again. So capturing is another thing. That's another element. James Bond almost always got captured, or at least confronted by the villain in some way. And you can use the spy idea. How would spies function in the real world? So those are several things that you can use. Those are several things that you can do, and those are the reasons why James Bond inspires me. Like I said, I know enough to know that I would not want to copy everything James Bond does. As a person, I really don't think he's that great of a guy. But the spectacle and the intrigue and the plotting and the spying and the fighting and everything, all that boils down to James Bond, are a reason why maybe you can find some inspiration in James Bond as well. With that said, remember that I love you, and if no one's told you that today, I mean it. I do love you. The world is a better place because you're in it, and I hope to see you at my table.